in the Islamic world is completely lost tradition of Islamic psychology. Living in the West oftentimes has the opposite effect of what Islamic psychology should have.
Is this really a discipline that we should be concerned about?
Islamic psychology has been the glue keeping together the inward and the outward in the Islamic world, taking care of the diet, taking care of the temperature, taking care of sounds, of light, of vision. And all these things are actually what Western psychology is arriving to today.
Every painful experience, in a way, contributes to your psychology and needs to be addressed.
Nowadays, everybody says they have a trauma, right? No matter how much you curate your life, the train is still going to arrive late.
You've actually changed a little bit of my worldview here. Western psychology is limited by its focus on the material aspects of human existence. My guest today is Dr. Francesca Bocca-Aldaqre, an Islamic psychologist and neuroscientist who asserts that much of what preoccupies Western psychology, such as the emphasis on the egotistical self, the fixation on Freudian concepts of repressed childhood trauma, and the tendency towards over-medicalization, does not only undermine healing, but also can be detrimental to individuals in the long run. Islamic psychology, according to Dr. Francesca, is a field that has been overlooked, overshadowed by a modernity that fails to recognize human beings as holistic living souls. Dr. Francesca offers a thoughtful critique of the maladies of capitalist life and also outlines a path towards a more balanced approach to living. Dr. Francesca Bocca-Aldaqre, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to The Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum salam.
So it's so lovely to have you with us. And the subject we're going to talk about today is Islamic psychology. Now, I have to say that I come across a lot of Muslims and they tend to hold very extreme views about this subject. There are some who dismiss it outright and say that it's very faddish, it's quite Western. Why should we care about psychology? You know, it's sort of the stiff upper lip type of approach to mental health. And then there's another side in the Muslim community who recognizes psychology and mental health issues, but their remedy is normally read Quran, which alhamdulillah we of course have to do, but the remedy is it stops there. Is there really an approach to psychology in Islam? Is this really a discipline that we should be concerned about?
Yes, thank you so much for allowing me to define this field, because I think it's the best starting point. In the Islamic sciences, there is a discipline called Ilm al-Nafs, and this is often translated as Islamic psychology. But there is a reason for doing that, and one of the reasons is that it answers the same questions that Western psychology answers to. And these are such as, who are we? How do we cure our mental and spiritual health? But Ilm al-Nafs does not only stop there. It answers even more questions, such as, what is the best way of struggling to become better people? So Ilm al-Nafs includes psychology and more, and I claim that it's a good idea to call it Islamic psychology so that people would know what are we talking about, which problems are we answering. But it doesn't stop at Ilm al-Nafs actually. In the classical Islamic sciences, there has been an integration of different disciplines forming Ilm al-Nafs, and that's answering these questions, such as fiqh, to understand whether a person is morally responsible, tafsir, to explain the terminology, and more, medicine, ethics. So it becomes also an interdisciplinary field.
Right. So you're placing Ilm al-Nafs or Islamic psychology within the context of these very classical Islamic sciences. But in Islamic history, was this subject taken seriously? Was it accepted in the same level as, say, the study of fiqh or tafsir in Islam?
Yes, indeed. And
Really?
I claim that Islamic psychology has been the glue keeping together the inward and the outward in the Islamic world.
Right.
And the Islamic world has pioneered not only the psychological knowledge seen as a philosophy, so who are we, but also mental health care through institutions that we know of, for example, the Bimaristans in the classical Islamic world.
Yeah.
In the classic madrasa curriculum, for people studying medicine or similar sciences, Islamic psychology, so Ilm al-Nafs, as well as Ilaj al-Nafs, so the cure also, was studied together. And nowadays, we tend to have forgotten a lot of the terminology pertaining it. For example, we tend to say we shouldn't have anxiety really, but when we call it waswasa, it is there. We remember that we have such a thing in Islam. Or we don't talk a lot about having a hard time, but the whole qabd and bast constriction and expansion we know of. It seems like, again, we have disconnected the interior and the exterior. So Islamic psychology is there to put this back together.
I suppose my query is how much is this beyond a subject of a remedy through Islam, right? So through Quran, through an observation of some of the really important ideas of Islam, and how much did Islamic psychologists in the past move beyond that and study this discipline in a sort of more holistic sense?
So this was done, I would say, in two fields.
Yeah.
One, which was more about pathology. And this was usually taken care of in the Bimaristan. And people would come in and like a mental health hospital, they would reside in it. And here, it was not only about spirituality, but the body was taken into account as well. So this was done through, for example, taking care of the diet, taking care of the temperature, taking care of sounds, of light, of vision. And all these things are actually what Western psychology is arriving to today. For example, how we do trauma work in psychology today is through integrating the body as well. But then there was the other half of Islamic psychology, which was about improving people that nowadays in the West we would call them already healthy, but we will see there is not such a distinction really in classical Islamic psychology. And this was called Tazkiyatul Nafs, so the purification of the self. And this was an ongoing work, not only when needed, but throughout one's life, one has to work every day on this aspect as well.
Right. Okay. So when we think about mental illness today, you know, often we come across people who say that I've got mental health issues, or I've got a problem with X or Y, and they would usually label that condition. From a sort of Islamic psychology perspective, what would be the approach to such a person who feels that they're struggling?
So I would make you an example, specific example, which is the one of trauma.
Yeah.
Because nowadays, everybody says they have a trauma, right? So it's a very overused term. But we should recognize, and this is not only in Islamic psychology, this is in wider mental health, even many Western authors agree on this, that not every painful experience is a PTSD.
Right.
So there is a difference between pain and a disorder.
Because we hear that a lot, right? Every painful experience, in a way, contributes to your psychology and needs to be addressed. You're saying from an Islamic perspective, that's just not a logic that we draw.
Yes. In my understanding, every painful experience needs to be addressed and integrated in ourself.
Yeah.
And it can be a painful experience of the body that will have a psychological consequence too. And it can be a deep grief and a sorrow, and that has a psychological impact too. Yeah. And this is not something I'm saying because I've been educated in the 21st century in psychology. If we look back, for example, Ibn al-Qayyim, al-Ghazali, they talk about this al-ahzan al-qadima, so these old sorrows, old pain that can really drag down the mind and the body of a person, and how to address those. And this comes in response to a claim that is very often made in the West, that, for example, there was not an idea of trauma before World War II. This is simply false. And we have, for example, in At-Tib al-Ruhani, Al-Razi talks about the sadamat al-nafs, so these very big shocks that the soul can have, and that can have, Ibn Sina says, even produce hallucinations. So this is very close to serious cases of PTSD. And in Islamic psychology, this is well known, understood, cured, and integrated as well.
So earlier on, Dr. Francesca, you talked about how in Islamic history, this subject was taken quite seriously. On a practical level, can you give examples of, you know, beyond maybe some fleeting examples of how seriously this was taken in the Muslim community?
Yes, and I'll start from claiming that until about 100 years ago, I would say that even the most rural countryside Sufi sheikh would know about these things.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
And in some places, it is still a common knowledge. People would still work on their nafs and know what it is. In Islamic psychology, we work on many levels. We work on the nafs, and we have said we translate ilm al-nafs as Islamic psychology, but nafs is something else.
Yeah.
Nafs is the ego, the psyche, the mind. It depends what it is, depending on the level in which you are.
Right.
So this is one aspect. Then there is the heart, the qalb. And we all know the importance of qalb salim, the sound heart in Islam. There is the aql, the mind, the way we think. And everybody nowadays goes crazy for cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And we already have that, because the cure of the Aql is also through straight thinking. And then we have the interaction of all these things with the spirit, the ruh, our nature, the fitra, all these things. The cure of all these things is included in Islamic psychology.
A mother's health is the heartbeat of a family. It nurtures not just her, but the life she brings into this world. When she is strong, her child thrives. When she is nourished, her love flows. Wellness isn't just about today, it's about the future. A future where every mother gets the care, the nutrition, and the support she deserves. Through the Wellness for Mamas and Babies Fund, Baitulmaal provides access to life-changing nutrition and healthcare for women and babies who are most vulnerable. From prenatal vitamins, nutrition counseling, OBGYN services, and more. Baitulmaal believes that when we invest in mothers, we invest in their children, their families, and in generations to come. A healthy mother builds a healthier world. It starts with her. It starts with us. Join Baitulmaal in supporting women, mothers, and children around the world. Give today.
So an Islamic psychologist, earlier on I think you used the word holistic, an Islamic psychologist will see and view the human being in this holistic way and deal with the human being as a holistic whole. Give me instances maybe of institutes that were established, if any, in the Muslim world in our history, where this discipline was executed, was seen by Muslims.
Yes, so concerning the clinical side of it, the Bimaristan network was perhaps the biggest net. And this was all over from North Africa until Central Asia.
Were these state-run institutions?
They were run through awqaf. So the idea was that it was done through private donations and that would then finance themselves. Yeah. And this has a deep effect on then what we will see about the abandonment of Islamic psychology, because the awqaf was a key player in mental health and spiritual health in the Muslim world. And in these Bimaristans, we had doctors, but not only, we also had other figures. Some were called, for example, the Hakim. And this is very similar to a psychotherapist, actually, because it's someone that sometimes does use herbal remedies, but oftentimes does talk therapy. Actually, even doctors did used to do talk therapy. Nowadays, we are very used to doctors doing these 10-15 minutes visits in which they just adjust medication. But in the awqaf system, the doctor used to take time. And so this would become a conversation. Ibn Sina has many methods to really engage with the mind and the nafs of the person. For example, measuring their pulse at the wrist and figuring out things that we would call today triggers them, right? So causes anxiety, and to evaluate that. So this is part of a whole system. We do not see in Islam psychotherapy as just the only road that we need to walk through, but the care for the human being passes through psychological concepts as well, although integrated.
So you would argue that this discipline is very much Islamic in its nature, like tafsir or like fiqh. It will be viewed at that level by Muslim practitioners of Islamic psychology.
Yes, I will just make an example that maybe helps people understanding better what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And that is, when we talk about ilm al-nafs, we do generally categorize levels of the nafs. And we say that a person is at a certain level and we have to help them getting unstuck or getting higher on that. And the names of these levels are derived from the Quran. So for example, the lowest level of the nafs is called al-nafs al-ammara. And we know this from Surah Yusuf. And then the second level is the nafs al-lawwama. This is also from the Quran. And then we have al-nafs al-mulhima as well. So this is a discipline which is built on Quranic terminology and whose understanding is rooted on tafsir.
Right. There may be many of my viewers, some non-Muslims, but also Muslims, who then would maybe summarize from what you've said so far that a strong Muslim is a Muslim who has resilience when it comes to mental health. What I mean by a strong Muslim is someone who has command of their nafs and is in constant communication with their creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and prays and keeps to the halal and haram. Is that necessarily the logic here, that a strong Muslim is a Muslim that has strong mental health?
I think in statistical numbers, yes, but this is not true on a case-to-case scenario.
Right.
And I'll explain this by talking about an analogy with the physical body. In general, in Islam, we tend to favor a lifestyle which is conducive of good health for the body. But there are some people whose constitution is weak, so they are prone to disorders and who just get sick.
Yeah.
The same would be true about mental health. At the same time, there are some key virtues that if we were to apply those from the classical Ilm al-Nafs, I think would improve mental health in more than 90% of cases. One of them is hilm, forbearance. And this is the ability, we call it resilience. It's very similar to that.
Yeah.
And it is so important that Al-Ghazali called it the crown of virtues. It is not just one good aspect to have. And to really have it, Imam al-Shadhili said that one should realize deeply, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. So these are things which you can see they're so rooted in the Quran and Sunnah, but their application is directly involved to many things. For example, not having forbearance, not being able to stand through the tests of life would make people weak. And we know what Ibn Khaldun then says concerning politics and sociology. This is a recipe for disaster. And that is what we're seeing in another way, I think, in the modern society.
Right. So forbearance, sabr, being resilient, these are really important Islamic concepts. I mean, are these merely intellectual ideas that one needs to incorporate through the Aql, or is there a deeper sense by which we incorporate and internalize forbearance within our psyche?
Yes, so differently from a more cognitive behavioral approach, which is nowadays very often used in mental health. Even we as Muslims do that a lot, in which you just talk through things, and by realizing, by cognitively analyzing it, a work of the Aql, we would say, of the rational mind, then it becomes true. In the Islamic psychology, we do not go this way. We tend to favor behavior over rationality. What does it mean? By walking the walk rather than talking the talk, virtues are acquired. And he also has basis in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ advised us to put in practice good behaviors, even if they don't come very natural to us, even if we have to do a bit of effort. This is actually a better way, and this will actually train us to then, in real life, be able to stand the big blows.
I mean, I remember a hadith, which I'm going to paraphrase, which suggests that if you want sabr, you should have sabr, right? Or you should seek sabr. So that's a similar idea, right? That you practice it in order to establish the concept. How valuable and important are concepts in this whole design of a human being? Because, of course, there may be some who don't focus on and understand, I don't know, the concept of tawakkul or rizq or sabr, and they don't contemplate and think about these ideas. And so it's not going to then ensue in their behavior. Are we suggesting that there is an interplay between Aql here and human behavior?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the wisdom of the Muslim psychologist is the one of understanding this person, where is their equilibrium? Every person will have a different one. Some people are very Aqli based, and nowadays people, we are all in our brain. So I would have to say, my guess is most people would be Aqli. But there are some people that are like qalbi, and they really feel not only their emotions in the shallower sense, but really feel things in their heart. Some people are more spiritual, some people are more bodily. And we know that, we see that in human beings all the time. So it is in the wisdom of the therapist not to approach everyone as if they were a copy of each other, but to respect their temperament. And so find a solution which is right for them.
Dr. Francesca, I think you've actually changed a little bit of my worldview here, because I see the world from a rational perspective. So even like these Islamic concepts, for me, I need to understand them deeply and read, of course, a hadith and the Quranic ayat around it in order to consolidate it, and then, of course, emulate the practices of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba and how they viewed tawakkul or how they viewed rizq or ajal. But you're basically suggesting here that human beings are actually different in their makeup. And there are some people who will evaluate and understand these psychological conditions through different lens, not just an Aql lens. And so one needs to capture, an Islamic psychologist would need to understand the entry point into improving that nafs. Have I got that right?
Yes, this is correct. And this is actually the exact reason why we can't tell people just pray it away.
Right.
We have to understand the person we have in front. And
Really?
we all know this. And if we are not having an insight on it from a theoretical side, let's think, for example, how do we feel anxiety? Some people feel anxiety in their head, they go overthinking. Some people feel it in their body, in their necks and in their shoulders. So there is this difference, and we know of this difference. Yet, when it comes to psychotherapy, and this is also very much an issue that we took from the West, of seeing psychotherapy as the thing where you're just talking and doing this journaling, and psychoanalysis where you're on the couch and talking about your dreams. But we shouldn't be the stereotypes in someone else's story. We have our own method and our own approach, and we love complexity in Muslim culture and in Muslim psychotherapy as well.
Yeah. Now, earlier on, you said that not all mental conditions, maybe the term wasn't mental conditions, but not all things should be pathologized to the degree that we call it a mental illness or a mental problem. I just want to unpick that because, of course, as you quite rightly said, we all have challenges in our lives, and we all go through points where issues happen. Maybe it's qadar of Allah, issues happen in our lives, and we have to deal with those issues. I suppose my question here is that, is there a danger, and maybe this leads ourselves to the critique of Western psychology, is there a danger of over-pathologizing normal human behavior when it comes to this subject of psychology?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that this pathologization has actually made a huge damage to the mental health of people. Really? And this is actually observed already in Western psychology. Really? There are many psychotherapists and many psychiatrists that nowadays argue, do not give people their diagnosis.
Okay.
And this is why, because when people receive a diagnosis and they say, okay, I am ADHD, I am a depressed person, and this becomes their whole personality. We see that a lot nowadays. We really live in the age where people identify with their mental health to such an extent that even their new behaviors are always reduced back to that disorders. And This is a mistake psychotherapists do too. So actually it is better to go through things as they are in the moment, to not try to pathologize and give names to conditions which might actually just be transient and temporary. Of course, there are pathologies which are given a names, and we as Muslims, we pioneered this. If we just look at Ibn Sina, Razi, and so on, there is a great, fantastic view of diagnoses and their divisions. So we do not refuse that. But what I'm saying is that human beings are full of complexity, and we shouldn't see them just as a disorder. Also, having a disorder in mental health does not preclude anything else. What I mean is that sometimes we give in on people that have bad mental health, as if they cannot grow spiritually, they cannot do anything. We see them as dysfunctional members of society. It's a very bad word to use, but it's the truth. But the same way, we wouldn't see a sick person in their physical abilities as a not able member of society. In the same way we should do with mental health. We should still stimulate people that are going through something mentally to seek spiritual growth, to seek community, to seek family, to seek things that make life complete.
Right, because when you mentioned earlier that people have different frailties, they have different ways by which they observe the world around them and deal with human behavior, right? Is it then fair to say that someone who may be brittle when it comes to mental health can actually become very resilient with the right sort of thinking and the right remedy to their condition?
Yes, of course. There are people that do not have what we would define a good mental health, but which are very insightful and can live meaningful life with it. And at the same time, in Islamic psychology, we do tell them that they're receiving a reward for the struggle that they're going through. And this is so motivating for them. We have people, and I think we all know of people that are very good at our example that were shuyukh but had waswasa, for example. So
waswasa being, explain it to some of our viewers.
So waswasa is part of anxiety problems, but it's a very specific one in which the thoughts that are disruptive are religious. And they're thoughts like, is my wudu still valid? Where am I? Should I renew it? Should I make prayer again? And they become obsessive in nature.
Right. Okay, that's an interesting one. I had a friend who had this problem when it comes to wudu. And so he would spend maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes doing wudu because he was not convinced that he had made wudu correctly. And my only remedy, and my apologies, I think I probably dealt with it wrong, was to approach it in a rational sense by saying, well, here's the hadith. and after 4 times you've done it, so don't worry about it, and you need to just overcome it. Is that how you address these waswasa issues with people that have these problems?
Well, usually we tend to go in Islamic psychology from the easiest remedy to the most complicated. So, of course, first time that someone has this type of thoughts, we just try to address it through the fiqh.
Okay.
But then if this thought is persisting, then usually it has to do with the core belief that people have. For example, I am responsible for my thoughts, or I am asked for perfection. And so we should address this. If they still don't work, then maybe it is something else. And so we go step by step, and we should never forget this incremental rationale.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, what I'm getting here is that the approach of an Islamic psychologist, and you're from this tradition, the approach of an Islamic psychologist is to think deeply about the human being and their holistic self, and then condition the response according to that. I mean, is this purely an Islamic thing in a way? Because of course there may be other Eastern traditions, for example, Chinese tradition, whatever, or Indian tradition even, that may have very similar approaches to human beings. I suppose my question is, how Islamic is this discipline when thinking about human psychology?
Yeah, I think that we could draw a parallel here to something that is very proper of our tradition. And it is a type of hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ is asked the same question by different people, and he gives different answers.
Yeah.
And this is one of our inspirations as Muslim psychologists. So to try to exactly address the person, what they need at that time.
Yes. Here's maybe a different way of viewing that question. Many early Muslims, when they engaged with the science of medicine, they borrowed a lot of medical advancement from different societies. So maybe Chinese medicine or Persian medicine, and they would develop it, of course, and incorporate it within the Muslim context. But in a sense, these medicinal achievements were there already, and Islam and Muslims is built on that. Is psychology, or an Islamic psychology, within that type of scientific context, or is there actually a very indigenous Islamic side to psychology?
Yeah, actually, the aspect of borrowing from different cultures is very important in understanding Islamic psychology.
Right.
Because indeed, there are some aspects which are borrowed from the Greek tradition, of course, the medicine, and from the Chinese and Indian tradition, some of the typization. And nowadays we do borrow, for example, from the West, some techniques that we might find helpful in some cases. But what I'm claiming here is that Islamic psychology is truly indigenous because its goal, it is mainly Islamic. And that is the one of cultivating a sound heart as defined in the Quran. So this cannot be taken from any other civilization, because the relationship of ubudiyya, the servanthood, which is defined as the goal of the person, and which is the path to spiritual and mental health, is indeed specific to Islam. So it can't be taken from somewhere else. And this also differs from one term that sometimes people use mistakenly, which is psychology for Muslims.
Right.
Sometimes people do care about mental health of the Muslim minority from a Western approach. This is another thing. So it's also very helpful to define and restrict the field. Otherwise, it's going to go into misunderstandings.
So what I'm getting from you there is that when we talk about Islamic psychology, it's not just Western psychology for Muslims. There is an actual discipline here that one needs to think deeply about and apply. Now, how prepared or informed are Muslims in dealing with these psychological problems? I mean, for example, I know nothing about Islamic psychology, but I will get people who come to me with challenges they face in their life, and I really don't know how to address their questions. I suppose my question here is that how equipped do you feel the Muslim community is? Can an imam, for example, address mental health challenges that people face within our community?
Yes, I think that here we really need to do a lot of work, to be honest.
Really?
Because there is some basic alphabetization that is missing.
Yeah.
I think what I'm seeing in most communities in the West is a deep disconnect between the terminology that they use in the Western language to talk about mental health and crisis, and the terminology from Arabic. And in the Islamic world is completely lost tradition of Islamic psychology. Even when talking the same language, when speaking in Arabic, the connection back to these classical sciences is oftentimes cut. So this really needs to be renewed completely, because issues such as, again, anxiety, depression, trauma, when we're talking about this, we can mean things in the Islamic tradition. They're not just empty containers that we use in English or whichever language.
Okay, that's so in the Islamic world today, because of course many of my non-Muslim viewers will probably say, okay, great, so let's look at the Islamic world, and we should be able to find beacons of Islamic psychology in the Islamic world. But you're here arguing that, if anything, Western psychology dominates the psychology field in the Islamic world. There's a disconnect with our past. Like so many of our traditions, I suppose, there's a disconnect with our past. Is that, are there any good signs, any good models of how you understand Islamic psychology in the Muslim world, or any practitioners we should know about?
Yes, of course, there is a renaissance, let's say, of
Really?
Islamic psychology nowadays. So one can find practitioners that do apply it. But I think that more attention has to be put as to the reasons why Islamic psychology was lost, because it was not just the loss of knowledge that is very easy to get back through books, through teachers, but it's the loss of a whole system that was put in place to cultivate the selves of people, to cure them when they were ill. And that is a catastrophic loss. And I would put it together with the political loss that Muslims have suffered since the fall of the caliphate.
Yeah.
The fall of the mental health system and the cure of the Nafs is similar to that in effects.
Yeah, I've heard a conversation between you and alhamdulillah, the great brother Paul Williams, where you talked about one particular person. Is it Malik Badri? Maybe I've got the name right or wrong. Tell me a little bit about Malik Badri and his contribution to renewing this renaissance in Islamic psychology.
Yes, so Malik Badri, rahimahullah, was a Sudanese scholar that was very active in the English-speaking world. That is why we know a lot about him in the English-speaking Islamic psychology community. And what he did is that back in the 70s, he figured out that Muslims were at a loss concerning mental health. And he figured out that they were just imitating the West, having minimal effects with Muslim clients, and also betraying their whole paradigm. And the danger was big, especially he was seeing the danger in the psychoanalytic approach and in the behavioral approach, approaches which reduce human being to either nothingness and just stimulus and response, or to very dark forces. And this, of course, is something that as Muslim we cannot accept, because we believe that all human beings have a good nature. Their fitra is toward absolute goodness. And this can be betrayed by the environment, by their experiences, but this goodness is there. So he started from this very simple point, and then through his life, he passed away not too many years ago. He really helped in highlighting some contributions from scholars, Al-Ghazali, Ibn al-Qayyim, al-Balkhi, less well-known scholars, but very important authors in classical Islamic psychology. And his interest was how they could provide clear-cut diagnosis already back before the year 1000. For example, issues such as schizophrenia or obsessions or neurosis and psychosis, these were clearly there. So his effort was towards this aspect. But we shouldn't forget there were many others who revived Islamic psychology without speaking English. And of course, we shouldn't be too Anglo concentrated. And for example, we have Uthman Najati in Egypt, who wrote a lot about Quran and Ilm al-Nafs, Hadith and Ilm al-Nafs. So even in the Arabic world, there has been a lot of revival.
Right, okay. And in that answer, you use the term fitra, I suppose loosely translated as human nature. How important is this concept when it comes to the greater science or discipline of Ilm al-Nafs?
This is fundamental.
Right.
First of all, because it is telling you something, that Islamic psychology is not just an approach for Muslims, but it's an approach for human beings.
Right.
And this, I believe, is a mission that our community has towards being therapeutic for the whole world. And we have forgotten it.
Really?
So the idea of the fitra, that everyone has this good nature inside them, and that through ilm al-nafs, through work on their nafs, to this internal struggle, they can rediscover it, they can polish it, they can bring it to light. This is an amazingly positive message to send to humanity. So this is the first aspect. And the second aspect is that we know some practical tips that we will bring people close to who they really are. For example, part of the fitra is related to bodily hygiene. This is not something disconnected to psychology. The psyche is so influenced by the body. And we know, for example, that in some mental disorders such as depression, hygiene is one of the things in which people struggle the most. So knowing that we have to help them through that route as well gives us a great advantage in treating them.
A lot of what we've said so far implicitly provides a critique of the Western discipline of psychology. So I want to go into that. I want to understand, how deep that critique is and where the overlaps are between Islamic psychology and Western psychology. But let's just go back to history. I mean, typically, I've got a friend who's a psychiatrist, and he would say that he would certainly have major problems. He's Muslim, major problems with the way his discipline works, and in particular, he talks about the over-medicalization of mental health. What is the role of medicine when it comes to Islamic psychology? And do you believe that? Do you believe that Western psychiatry, psychology over-medicalizes basic human conditions or soft human conditions?
Yes, I do believe so.
Yeah.
And I think that the criticism that Islamic psychology would do to this approach, as from many aspects, one of them is a scientific criticism. And it is the fact that many of these medications that are prescribed are meant for acute temporary use. And there are scientific studies that show us their effectiveness and their harmfulness relative in about 1 year, 5 years course. But we all well know that these are prescribed sometimes for 20 years, for 30 years. So from an Islamic perspective, we should avoid harm. We do not know these things are harming people. We do not know the effects. So this, from a side of the responsibility, we should avoid that as much as possible. Secondarily, medication is not the only response. So we cannot help anyone, no matter what their condition is, through only the channel of medication. It always has to come together with other approaches. And that is why the Bimaristan model was successful, because it took people out of the context for a while, and they had good food, good air. The place of the Bimaristan sometimes was even chosen because of the quality of the air in it, of the water in it. Okay. And so all these aspects make mental health care. Going it through medication means just suppressing the symptom. But this is not a merciful care. This is just making the person productive again to join a rat race, which is fundamentally flawed. And this is not only a criticism to Western psychology or psychiatry, but to the Western living system, I would say.
Right. Okay. So, Bimaristan, how would it function? So, if someone has a mental breakdown. Again, I'm not even sure I'm using the right term here, but has a mental or a challenge mentally, and practitioners realize, okay, this person needs to be taken out of their context, and they have to be improved and helped. Just like walk me through, typically, I don't know, in the 13th century, 14th century, a Muslim or a non-Muslim even has this mental ailment. What would they expect from this Bimaristan?
Yes, I was just recently in the Nuri Bimaristan in Damascus, and which is now a museum of Arabic science, and
Really?
they do explain in it quite a bit.
Yeah.
And this is it was one of the most important Bimaristans. So in it, typically, the person would come in, and first they would see a place. And let's talk also about the influence of architecture and art to mental health. This is something we have forgotten.
Really?
So if you have ever been in a mental health institution here in the West, they're not pleasant places.
Just as a side, I went to see my friend in his workplace, and it was a very demoralizing place. So you're saying that even sort of the aesthetics of the building and the internals will be thought through.
Yes, of course. And the Nuri Bimaristan, but many others are like that. It's a beautiful building. It is airy. It is spacious. There are images of peacocks and beautiful animals all around. There is calligraphy. There are mirrors. There is marble. And it's full of plants as well. There is the connection of the human being with plants and with the birds that nest inside these plants. And there is a fountain. And the rooms are airy and spacious and not all connected to each other. So if a person is mentally unwell, you do not want to hear their screaming in your room. So these things are given an attention. And then a doctor would come to see you. And this doctor would definitely take a look at your diet and prescribe you certain types of food of others, would take a look at your clothes even. And the color of clothes even was thought of. The color of the walls of the room was tailored for the type of sickness that the person was going through. And then would prescribe something. It could be, of course, medication. And there is a whole science of simple medication and compound medication in Islamic medicine. So just one herb, one remedy at a time, or more than one. And there are reasons for that. And then, of course, you would be given a program as well. This means that your day is not spent idle like nowadays in psychiatric hospitals, where the only person you see is the nurse slamming your door at 5 a.m. and traumatizing you every morning. But it is a gentle routine, which is with the rhythm of the sun and the prayer and the reading of the Quran and the animals and the air. Even the call to prayer, we know, right? In Muslim lands, the tone of the call to prayer changed depending on the time of the day and its effect on the Muslim psyche. So everything had to work together.
We're at the stage of this interview where we're talking about sort of criticisms of Western psychology, but earlier on there was a implicit criticism of just Western living standards. And again, we don't want to overgeneralize here. And of course, life is different in many cities around the Western world. But generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that we live in a neoliberal society, and consumption and wealth generation is probably the most important priority for most people, men and women in these societies. How damaging to our mental health is neoliberalism?
I don't like usually to speak in black and white terms, but in this case, I think it's appropriate to say that living in the West oftentimes has the opposite effect of what Islamic psychology should have. And I would like to motivate this a little bit more. The first is the fact that the Nafs is told, take whatever you can, be greedy, take more, you need more. And this is exactly the lowest stage of the Nafs. And we usually work in a model that has 7 stages of the Nafs. So there's a lot of room to improve. We're stuck in the first and the lowest, which is Nafs al-Ammara, the Nafs that wants, that orders, that wants more, more, more. And the proof of it is that people, when they have this enlightenment model in the West, the best they can do is criticize themselves, which is the second stage of the Nafs. Nafs al-Lawama, the self-criticizing Nafs, which is destructive and brings to guilt. The Nafs al-Lawama is supposed to be a short step, and then you move on to the higher stages. But in the West, we're stuck.
You shouldn't wallow in self-criticism.
Oh, never. This is one of the main problems that Muslims have nowadays. This guilt is not ours. We do not live in guilt. We repent, and then we move on. We reorient our heart towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then we move on. And going back to the issues of the Western model of mental health care is another disaster, complete disaster, is the constant distraction. The ghafla, technically, it's really what is the enemy of growth of the nafs. And which means scrolling and being constantly entertained, and there's music everywhere. And this is not from a position of fiqh, I emphasize. This is from a position of care. Like, I don't advise even non-Muslims to do these things. And so sometimes I claim it is correct to be sick. It is good if people feel anxiety and feel meaningless and feel horrible in this, it's fine, it's good. So what is the solution then? Because it's a big problem. And in the Islamic tradition, we do have a solution for this. It is called zuhd. So asceticism. What does it mean? If the rat race is something you do not want to join, and if the system is broken, get out of the system. And there are different ways to do that. And one is to want less. And this is not to sound like Buddhist. It is something that comes from our tradition.
Yes.
Desire less, consume less, eat less, sleep less even sometimes can be therapeutical too. And you will desire less, and you will be then a bit disconnected from this, and you will find the clarity. Because if you do not spend all your time on social media, you have time to think. If you do not spend all your time in entertainment and work and commute, you will be able to gain the spiritual and mental strength to really see the life as it is. And this is required, is the first step for any change.
I think that's really, really fascinating. I mean, I spent some time in Muslim world in Istanbul. And of course, Istanbul is as westernized as so many of the Muslim cities. But the very basic idea of organizing your routine around the adhan had a fundamental effect, I think, on me, you know, and I could feel that I was slowing down in a positive sense, and I was more contemplative, where in the West, you don't get really much time to think about yourself and to think about sort of greater issues. What is it about the Islamic lifestyle that promotes this harmony, I suppose, with the psyche?
Yes, and one key aspect here is, of course, the relationship with the transcendent. Of course, this is by itself would be something that saves the mental and spiritual health of anybody.
Right,
But
so relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. But this relationship also comes through secondary relationships, such as our relationship with the world, the sun, nature, the seasons.
Yeah.
It is absolute craziness that in the West we wake up at 6 a.m. and sometimes it's dark, sometimes it's light, it's hot, it's cold. What are we doing? Why are we doing that to ourselves?
Yes.
And sometimes, again, we are so entertained and we are so into the rat race that we do not realize we're doing something crazy. But when we move out or we see how life could be, respecting our body, respecting the world around, the season, the time of the day, the natural humors that the body has and the temperament has in reaction to light, to temperature, to basic things, then we realize that also other fundamental things, such as the consuming of food, the fact that in the Muslim world, we generally are not encouraged to eat 3, 4, 5 times a day, but like 1 or 2, and that's enough. And we discover that so many things are enough, that it really, our body feels secure, our nafs feels secure because we have enough. And then finally, the ruh, the spirit inside us can talk. And the talk of the ruh is the most beautiful talk that we can have. So it's not our voice of the nafs saying, I want more, I'm not okay. These are the lower stages, of course, but you can't arrive to the higher ones before working the lower ones. So you have to go through a lot of pain. The voice of the ruh, the voice of the fitra is a beautiful voice. And if we want to have it to shine through, we need to work on the nafs by exiting many of the comforts that were given for granted.
Yeah. But of course, practical life requires us not to. I mean, I met a lot of people in Istanbul who did escape the rat race and now living in a semi-Sufi state in Istanbul. But we can't all do that, right? We have responsibilities and we have to, earn, and we have families. And so all of this remains a concern for us, right? So how, in that context, in the context of extreme capitalism, let's say, can we balance our lives and have this mizan that a lot of people talk about?
Yes, I think a key word for that would be presence, hudur. I have many clients that tell me, look, I really want to improve my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but I cannot take 4 hours more to pray in a day. And I tell them, you're not asked that specifically. You're asked to be present with what you're doing and improving, starting on that. So even if we live in the West, and even if there is no adhan, like I live in Italy, there's no adhan at all. We don't have a mosque in most places. Still, you have the choice, you have the opportunity to being present. And classical scholars like Al-Ghazali, he already wrote 1,000 years ago about the importance of muhasiba, meaning weighting your intentions, your actions, your words, being present and aware of what you're doing. Self-discipline is a key ally to make use even of the worst circumstance in which you might be. Do not desire to move away and run away in the parallel life, because this is fantasy. Al-Ghazali said this is a sickness of the heart. You have to run away from fantasizing. You have to be where you are, when you are just now, to be Ibn al-Waqt, the son of the instant.
Okay, it's really something that you mentioned Ghazali there, because of course, so many people I speak to who want to escape life and want to live in this sort of spiritual nirvana, let's say. And I'm not dismissing that. I think if you can do it, it's fantastic. We'll cite Ghazali as someone who had this, I don't know what we would call it, a midlife crisis or a crisis of spirituality, some even say, where he did leave his teaching career and he went into the wilderness for a number of years and spent time thinking and rethinking some of his perspectives. I mean, but you've used Ghazali in the sense of saying that's actually a problematic way of living. So how do we square that circle when we think about Ghazali?
I think that there are many ways to look at Ghazali, and one is look at his life, and one is look at his works.
Okay.
These are not exactly the same. Why? Looking into his life, it is the example of a very famous teacher, an alim of a specific time period who had a very strong spiritual experience. Not all of us would go through that.
Yeah.
But he wrote the Ihya Ulumuddin, the revival of the religious sciences, for people like us, or a bit better than us maybe, but that would need to find an answer of how to practice Islam in the real world, not in his life. So we do not need, again, to make a dream of someone else's experiences or to have this utopia. Muslims nowadays tend to live in a lot of utopias of a different time, a different place, and then many times they do end up radically changing their life and still being in this state of anxiety. So if we look instead of the works of Imam Ghazali, we do see one of the earliest manual of Islamic psychology, where what he's telling us is be aware of yourself every day. There is this muraqaba cycle, the attention towards oneself. Every day you should go through it, and it is about effort, it is about intention, it is about evaluation. So there is no mystical escape to that. And Allah, of course, can give specific experiences to people, but we shouldn't be based on the specific experience of someone else to find the path for the majority. So
yeah, young people, and maybe what I'm going to say is a generalization. I used to teach young people, young adults, and I found over the last 10 years that certain terms related to mental health became quite commonplace in my interactions with them. So trauma, as we mentioned before, becomes a very common language. Sometimes even a reason why they can't hand in an essay, for example, because they're reevaluating sort of childhood trauma, for example, or triggering is another term that is often used. I suppose without belittling what could actually be some very serious context to that person, just like talk me through whether you feel these pathologies, let's say, are overused now in Western societies, and whether Western psychology, as I think you've intimated before, addresses those sorts of conditions in the wrong way, if that makes sense.
Yes, I do believe that by using this terminology, we are doing a great mistake and we're not helping people at all. Because what we're telling them is, paraphrasing, if you're triggered by something, is you do not have the capability to face it. You do not have the internal resources to deal with it. So please either shut down or run away.
So forever now, you can't be in a situation where that condition is in your presence because you'll be triggered. That's the idea.
And the ironic thing is that the actual psychotherapy, the cognitive behavioral therapy of issues like phobias is through exposure. So what are we doing here? Sometimes I feel that Western psychology really is missing a framework with which it is working. Because on one side, it is very evidence-based. So it tells people, well, you need to work on it. It's going to be hard. To expose someone to their phobia is a horrible work to do in psychotherapy. But at the same time, it's telling them, please, do run away from it. Do put your boundaries, another overused term, right?
Yeah, tell me about boundaries. I hear this a lot. Yeah, what's that idea, and why is that a problem?
Yeah, so the idea of boundaries is that people can hurt us at any time. So people that hurt us more than once, or that hurt us systematically, or that hurt us in a terrible way, we need to erect a wall around them. And this makes sense in some aspect. But on the other hand, the idea of putting boundaries before anything else, and especially how boundary work is done in Western psychology, it oftentimes means going no contact with people like family or close friends. This is problematic because we know that things are going to come at a cost in Islamic psychology. So there are people in our life which will be there making good, but then eventually also producing some pain. And sometimes it is worth it. And sometimes we do not have a possibility to judge whether it's worth it or not. We're just there. And acceptance in that is going to be a key. Of course, I'm not saying whether there is abuse to just skip with the abuser. But boundaries is another of this work that then causes people to be isolated, which causes the loss of community, the loss of family, which destroys mental health. So sometimes with this very protective terminology, we're actually making people more isolated, more vulnerable, and less believing that they can manage life. So this is a disservice to them.
I remember coming across a hadith which had a profound effect on me. It was about a Muslim living within a community, and and again I'm paraphrasing here, but a better Muslim, or someone is of a better level if they live with people and deal with their harm than if they live alone and avoid their harm. I suppose that's what you're saying here, that if you live in communities, you are going to have to live with people who've got their foibles, they've got their own ways of dealing with things, and one needs to find a way to live with those people rather than to isolate. Is that what we're saying here?
Yes, part of it is this that we're saying. I'm also saying something else, and that's we have forgotten virtues for the price of comfort. So
virtues, give us.
Yeah, so nowadays basically the West is telling you what matters the most is that you feel good, you feel at ease with yourself.
The self.
Yeah.
Right.
But the point of life is that you're not going to. There's going to be difficulty no matter how much you curate your life. The train is still going to arrive late and the wife is still going to disappoint. Whatever, things are going to happen.
Yes.
So why not, also from a rational point of view, build the resources to then be able to face these things with this hilm, this forbearance, saying, okay, my nafs might be telling me I don't want this, but my qalb, my heart tells me I can do this and this is good, I'm fine. Imagine this. People, if they can imagine it, of course, even non-Muslims would love to have this for their life. And in the West, there have been philosophies in the past, for example, Stoicism, right? It claimed you really have to bear with life. And even acceptance and commitment therapy based on Buddhism. And you have to accept life as it is. So we're saying something along these lines, but adding on the reward on it, and the fact that through service, through khidmah, the human being can realize its purpose. And it is such a great feeling that even on mental health, on spiritual health, is going to pay back these things and more.
So I came across a situation recently of some members of my family who stopped talking to one another, which Islamically is quite problematic because it's a close family because of what was said in some sort of context, right? And I found that the excuse was that I need space and I can't face this type of maybe the word trauma was used, but this type of abuse or whatever, and it was just words. It was words and an argument. Islamically, I would imagine that type of approach to isolate yourself from other members of the family is problematic. Is that a fair? I don't know. How would you respond to? Because you see this a lot, family breakdown. It's not on the big issues. It's on behaviors and language. People, Yeah,
in Islamic psychology, we tend, of course, to agree with the fiqh of it. So the fiqh of it is that you have 3 days after an argument, and then you have to start again. Yeah. And in Islamic psychology, there is a wisdom in it, that the more you go without having done something, the harder it gets, even if it doesn't make sense intuitively. Yeah. But if you haven't spoken to your father for 2 years, with which courage are you going to message them now? Yeah. But if it's 2 days, 3 days, then it's easy. Yeah. Yeah. But on the other hand, there are also some other aspects in which the cutting off is actually an expression of the nafs many times rather than a protection of the individual. What do I mean? Sometimes we do not want to have someone in our life because they remind us that we are not all-powerful. And this is not a good sign from the nafs.
That's good.
So we do not want someone in life not because they harm us more than they do good to us or because they're intrinsically evil, but because they want things done their way and we want things done our way because we want it. And this is the lowest level of the nafs. So I also encourage people to do the nafs work because after having done it, these things are not going to be a big issue anymore. You're going to be detached from such, small and day-to-day issues. You're going to be really able to bear with them and to be with sakina, with serenity through these circumstances of life without bypassing it, just saying pray more, read Quran more. But it is the nafs work that needs to be done.
So in a way, you're saying that, for the sake of yourself, you should be, and you should, within reason, you should be around people who question you, even if it's unjustly in a way. I know Umar bin Khattab used to have this sort of philosophy that he used to like it when people questioned him and made him rethink his ego and his perspectives. I remember actually the most cutting thing my brother said to me was, "I thought you were a thinking Muslim," and I found that that really there's nothing he says but once in an argument he said that to me, and for a while I was like perturbed by that. But I think it was probably quite a good thing for me to hear. And it was a silly argument, but it was a good thing for me to hear. So that's interesting. That's I think you're sort of explaining, conceptualizing this human conditioned to allow, we should be in contexts that sometimes are uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I will take again from Al-Ghazali here.
Yeah.
Because at a certain point, he says, well, if you want to improve in your nafs, if you want to improve as a person, what can you do? Well, you could find a sheikh, but it's very hard to find a sheikh in our time. So imagine now. So at a certain point, he says, well, you could listen to what your enemies are saying, because some of the things they're going to tell about you, they're going to be right.
Yeah.
So eventually the point is, okay, you're offended, but who are you to be offended eventually? We are nothing. And in the moment in which we realize we are nothing, that is the door to liberation, really, from these nafs and these vices. And when we're talking about virtues, and you were asking me before, these are good traits of behavior, but good traits of behavior come from realizing one's own place. That not everyone is going to respect us and treat us well and make us the center of the world, because we aren't. And that's just the reality. But nowadays, this extreme self-age in which we're living, everything is like an Instagram feed and we are the protagonists of reality. And this creates such an inflated sense of the nafs that if it wasn't for their nafs, we wouldn't know who we are. And that is a disaster.
Fascinating. You said that find a sheikh. So that seems to be, quite in vogue at the moment. People, how important is it, especially for young Muslims, to have a mentor, to have someone who helps them walk through and talk through some of their more sort of problematic conditions?
Yeah, I think that's very important. But sometimes its importance is a bit overstated,
Really?
I would say sometimes, especially in the West, where there is this idea I cannot achieve anything if there isn't a sheikh, or it's like a level of the video game to be unlocked. If you have the sheikh as like your superior,
type,
we shouldn't fall in this type of problems, of nightmares eventually, because this is also the door of spiritual abuse. Because if you need to have a sheikh at every cost, what are you going to tolerate from them? And there are some sheikhs even that are putting into question the nature of what a sheikh should do nowadays. Is it just a good old tariqah? Is it going to be something different? Is it going to be open lectures? And we are seeing shuyukh exploring many different alleys, and this is their job to do. I don't know what's going to work eventually. But I think, of course, if one wants to really grow, they need to find someone to help them, because the path alone is really dangerous. But it doesn't have to be a certified quote-unquote sheikh.
Right.
It can be one's husband. It can be your relative, your friend, the imam at the mosque, someone teaching you a good word. It can even be a YouTube channel. As long as there is growth, it's fine. And then Allah can put in front of you what you need in that moment. So do not become obsessed with some fantasy again. This is really, fantasizing is one of the key problems in the ummah nowadays. So we need to accept how reality is. And one of my teachers of Islamic psychology, Dr. Rothman, says that Islamic psychology is be with what is and be with Allah. So it's not obsessing, fantasizing. It's just, this is who you are now. How are we going to improve this?
Great. I read something of yours, or maybe heard something of yours, where you said that Islamic psychology is not born to cure disorders. And I found that a little bit odd. Explain that to me. We're not here to cure disorders.
Yeah, this is a criticism, actually, that comes from seeing how Western psychology is set. And this is not a criticism we're only doing as Muslims. There is some internal criticism in Western psychology too. And this is the positive psychology movement that said, but why does Western psychology look at the human being starting from sickness? So, and there is the stereotype, right, that we're all mentally sick, but we only realize it when we go to the therapist. And this, I think, is fundamentally flawed. In Islamic psychology, this discipline is not born to cure diseases and leave people on their own. Islamic psychology is supposed to be the daily work you do on yourself until you're alive. So, of course, there is going to be moments in which there is an emergency. But then there are going to be moments in which you're just growing, and it is the quiet, everyday work that you do going through and improving your nafs, improving your qalb. So this is not that is born out of emergencies. This is what is born. Also, Islamic medicine is the same. So there is a lot of guidelines on health, on food, on lifestyle. It is the same way. We are going to keep an equilibrium and to promote it, not only be there when things are horrible and then throw back.
Right. Okay. So in a way, we all have to integrate some of these techniques into our lives and and work on our nafs so that when we do come across challenging situations, we're able to deal with that, inshallah, in a better way. That's sort of the better way, the more comprehensive way of living as a Muslim.
Yes, and we have treasures from the past. There is many of these classical books that perhaps are the first step that anyone can really look at. They're the work of Al-Ghazali, of Ibn al-Qayyim. Anything on classical suluk or tazkiyatul nafs is going to cover a lot of the territory that we need to do in the daily life. Of course, for emergencies, this is left to specialists. But for the day-to-day work, this is something that we need to do. And when people really discover this knowledge, the knowledge of the nafs, they will stop feeling that Islam is something outward, and then there is their life, their dramas, their mental health, everything else is a parallel life. They will start feeling integrated. They will really start feeling the connection between the inside and the outside, I think.
Dr. Francesca, a while back, there was a book I came across, Bowling Alone, and this sort of phenomenon of young people in particular living isolated lives, long periods of time where they don't have companionship and friendships, or at least those friendships are not involved friendships. A lot of it is online, and a lot of it is punctuated by long periods of isolation. We've got this sort of phenomenon of solo traveling, that, you know, it's better that you travel alone. Just talk me through the value of community and the value of companionship when it comes to the mind.
Yes, this is fundamental. And actually, if we think, even in the Quran, there is a reminder that even animals are created in communities. Yet nowadays, we think we can live alone. And this is really foreign to our nature. From an Islamic perspective, we have many unities we're part of. And there is the family, and then there is marriage, and this creates a wider family, and then there is community, there is the mosque. There are a lot of opportunities for people to become part of groups. But many of these opportunities have been destroyed. For example, classically, a person would also be part of a corporation. Their colleagues would be an actual functional unit. And this sometimes would be also in the form of a taqi or a zawiyah, so a spiritual unity. And as these unities have been destroyed, they haven't been replaced by anything. And of course, we talk about issues such as the epidemics of loneliness, especially in the UK. This is a great problem, and we see it in states and in places where families are nuclear, they are smaller, and people tend to move out earlier when they start studying or working. And the horrible effects of mental health are well documented. So from an Islamic standpoint, the key idea here is to cultivate meaningful relationships. We say these a lot in the West, but what do we mean from an Islamic perspective? Well, this means that relationships should never be based around lahu, so useless talk. What are they based around? They're based around service, so that can be one, love, that can be another, and companionship. So if we take good purposes, and again, this brings back to the Nafs work, because if we're doing our Nafs work and we're interrogating ourselves, why are we cultivating this relationship today? Then we need to give an answer, and we need to see if that answer is compatible with these purposes. But many times we just live randomly, even in the Muslim community. So even if we have relationships, we just have them because they're there. Sometimes even we get married because we have to get married. We have children because we have to get children, and then we become overwhelmed. But Nafs work can actually prevent all these things from happening, because it guides a person through the stages of life with presence and meaning.
Right, okay. And you know, capitalist society tends to perpetuate this isolation and individualism. I mean, of course, there are some neoliberal philosophers who actually talk about how individualism is the superior way of living. So fundamentally, like ideologically, conceptually, we would say that's harmful not just to society and the practicalities of life, but it's harmful to your mental health. Yeah,
to be honest, I don't know how they can argue from it from a mental health point, because things such as spirituality, community are known epistemologically from both theoretical, but even there are bases in studies, in observations, let's say. Of course, it's not hard science. These are always observations, but still, they tell us something, that human beings are meant for meaningful interaction and not just from consumption. And we can see it from all walks of life. People who cultivate meaning outside work. And sometimes in the West we have this misunderstanding, which is very harmful on mental health, that one can find self-affirmation through work, or that one can find their meaning through work. This is such a strange idea if we really unpack it from an Islamic psychology perspective, because work, something we do to earn money to feed our family. That's what work is. It's not the meaning of life. These spheres are usually kept completely separate in classical Islam. In fact, one would have their job and then would go to the taqiyya and see their sheikh, would go to their family, would go to the mosque, would go to many different environments. Yet nowadays, we have fallen for the trick of capitalism, which tells us, look, work more so you can become more yourself, which is the only thing that is moving us. But we should be able to do this work of presence and see illusions as such.
Right. There's an epidemic of suicide amongst men. And we know that in many societies. I'm not sure if it's just Western societies. I suspect there is also a problem in Eastern societies that men are more susceptible to suicidal thoughts and even, unfortunately, suicide. Why do you think that is, and how does your discipline, Islamic psychology, deal with this problem that seems to be targeted and focused very much on men in particular?
It's crucial to keep into account gender when we're treating mental health. It's something I haven't mentioned yet. But in Islamic psychology, we wouldn't treat in the same way a male and a female person suffering from the same disorder.
Yeah.
And we have a basis for this in Islam. And of course, for example, we have the discipline of futuwa, right, of chivalry, which is generally aimed towards men.
Right.
But nowadays, men do not have this futuwa anymore. They don't know really what are they meant to become. What is their model? Is it going to be the super aggressive alpha podcaster or whatever of that? Or it's going to be the hyper understanding and non-threatening type of human being? And in both of them, there is an imbalance. And of course, people are going, if they lose their identity and meaning, nowadays it's a disaster because all you have left is identity nowadays, unfortunately. Sometimes even Islam becomes just an identity. We live through, we are the Muslims, so we should be against the Westerners. And this is the beginning of destruction in many aspects. But going back to suicide, this is an issue that it is deriving sometimes from many feelings being bottled up by men choosing more lethal ways of suiciding and not talking about it and not going through prevention. And this some parts of it are socialized, so we have learned from the environment, but some part of it talk to masculine nature of not really seeking for help a lot. And that is why it is a key, especially in the West, where this epidemic is present, for the khatib, for the imams, to talk about these aspects of life. And this is because we're losing people to it. We do not have a lot of, for example, suicide helplines active from an Islamic perspective. We do not have a lot of prevention. And sometimes when a suicide does occur, we talk about it in the wrong way, which can actually cause even more people to commit the same act. So it is necessary for people to be alphabetized about it and to consider gender as well. Because a man without a purpose is going to have different mental and physical manifestation than a woman. And we should recognize this and integrate it.
In our earlier conversation, we talked about how Islamic psychology was an embedded discipline within the Muslim world. And there were institutes that were set up that dealt with this human condition. And it was in popular parlance, there was no stigma attached to those who went through challenges in their life and couldn't find sort of the internal tools to deal with it. But of course, when we think about psychology today, we often think about sort of Western psychology, and our parents and their parents often didn't, talk about these issues and were very cold. I know, not in a negative sense, but cold to some of these sort of psychological issues. So there seems to be a disconnect between our illustrious Islamic history, where these diverse sciences were taught and practiced, or disciplines were taught and practiced, and the last 100, 200 years. What went wrong? Why is there a disconnect between our current sort of condition and generation and those of the past?
This is a very important problem to address, because sometimes it can seem this is a simple problem of, oops, we forgot something, but it's not. So this heritage has been consciously destroyed through colonialism.
Consciously?
Yes.
Right.
I'll make a few examples to make it more clear. And this is not only Muslim observers that said it, but also non-Muslims, such as Frantz Fanon, who wrote on Wretched of the Earth. He criticized Western psychiatry a lot. And it says that the West, through colonialism, is not only satisfied with destroying a people's present, but also its memory, its past, and this is done through psychiatry. There are other authors. For example, there has been a period in Egypt after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in which psychoanalysis became the key for the elite to read their own past. And there have been critics of it, like Abdul Wahab al-Masiri. He said this psychoanalysis reduces the soul to a bundle of dark impulses and desires. And this was brought to dominate these people. And again, in the British India, there was this Lunatics Asylum Act, which closed all the existing, they weren't called Bimaristan, but mental health hospitals that were taking care of the mentally ill. And in Central Asia, when we had the Soviet government, practices of Islam were taken as signs of mental health instability. So on the one hand, discriminalization of classical practices. On the other hand, closure of the awqaf system. This has been a disaster because these weren't kept in place by the states. They were kept in place by donation. And on the awqaf, we could talk a lot how that is an alternative to capitalism and to state-run institutions. So this was taken out. The madrasa curriculum was taken out, and they used to teach ilm al-nafs. And then, of course, we have the intellectual colonization, where it stigmatized certain practices, such as ruqya, such as dhikr, as folk psychology, like they don't really work. And especially the targeting of Sufism in early Salafism, in early modernization, it has a meaning in the tradition of Islamic psychology, because these things have been marginalized and then forgotten.
Just to go back a little bit, ADHD and some of these sort of conditions that, again, I come across this amongst young people a lot. Are these exaggerations, and you know, you talked about how people are identified according to these conditions. Like, just talk me through. Many parents will be watching this show, and they may have children who suffer from, you know, this. I have a spectrum, and they're on this side of the spectrum, wherever. Like, talk me through how you would view some of these conditions.
In this type of disorders, especially the ones that are born in infancy, we should take into account the whole system.
Right.
And we shouldn't criminalize like either the medication or the diagnosis. I'm going to make an example. And this is with ADHD.
Yeah.
Sometimes child is born, and when they're less than 1 year old, they start using a screen. And sometimes they're not really accompanied by a trusting figure as well. And sometimes they're put through long periods of isolation, like kindergarten, and then they come back home and there are screens. Yeah. And then they're fed a diet which is poor and it's full of sugars and a layering of conditions, and then they develop ADHD. Now, are we going to point the finger at too much diagnosis of ADHD? Right. Or rather, there is a whole system that is not really helping development in the best way, keeping in mind that development has to include nature and a contact with nature. And traditionally, people used to have contact with animals, which are used as a therapy of ADHD in many cases. Yes. And nutrition has a key role, and screen exposure has a key role. So all these factors sometimes are part of the problem. And it's very hard to point a finger at one and say, well, you shouldn't medicate people with ADHD. What I claim is that this is like diabetes. You can't take someone off insulin if they have eaten sugar drinks for a lifetime or they had a poor lifetime for a long time. Sometimes they develop a sickness, and it is there. So you should recognize it and treat it, but try to rethink the whole system and try to not only medicate, but to put patches in other points if possible, because the more holistic the care, the higher the effects are going to be. So combine medication with talk therapy, with nature, with a good diet. And many times mental health can be managed through a combination of those rather than relying simply on medication.
Earlier on today, alhamdulillah, I met your son, 15 years old, mashallah, you know, very, very bright young man. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him, you know, goodness, and make him of service to his ummah. And I wondered while I was walking with him how much you think about your discipline when it comes to bringing up a child in, you know, societies that sometimes are hostile to our traditions? Like, what is it? Just to, like, on a practical level, how do you think about, because, you know, so many parents today are suffering, maybe belatedly, they didn't realize, but suffering from some of the behaviors and attitudes of their children once they reach the teenage years. Like, what do you think about when bringing up a young man or a young boy, a young girl in these sorts of
This is difficult to summarize because I think about it a lot, to be honest.
Yeah.
So some aspects have to do with general lifestyle management. And this is the same as I think about myself. And this is because we live in a world, in an environment where the default choice is not really good for mental health.
Right.
And these, again, are simple things like how much time are we spending this week in nature, contemplating nature. And we know this is something that the Prophet ﷺ used to do. So this is not marginal for hippies or whatever. This is part of our balance. Yeah. And then I think about how much did I express my emotions towards him, if I did give him positive inputs today, if the feedback I'm giving him is meaningful, if I took care of his also mental development. And he's now 10, so in a stage where really the mind grows up and they start abstracting and thinking, am I taking care of that too? So I think most parents actually have this type of thoughts. So in Islamic psychology, what really matters is doing things for ihsan, and not because we want a certain result. I think this is one of the best advice for parents, because people and children are going to be their own person, and you cannot control who they become as an adult, but you can control the ihsan, the perfection that you are giving to this education. Yeah. And if you really are focused on doing the best you can do, this is going to be much easier and being with a lot of less anxiety, which is a key in parenting nowadays. Many parents also tell me, I'm very anxious. I think every day, what is he going to do when he becomes older? Will he find a job? These things, let's leave them to someone else as Muslims, and let's focus on being present.
Great. Sorry, I aged him by 5 years. My apologies about that.
Mashallah.
So, my final question is about Gaza. Of course, what's happened to the Muslims of Gaza is horrendous. And they've gone through, you know, almost 2 years of this collective pain as a community. Yet we do see on our screens, you know, stories of resilience and stories of those who lose their family members, but so remain very steadfast and have sabr. And, you know, these qualities are, subhanAllah, angelic qualities almost, or prophetic qualities that we all wish we had when it comes to loss and when it comes to adversity. Sometimes we can over-romanticize, of course, you know, what they're going through. And I'm sure that the pain and the anxieties remain in that society. Just, you know, how do you evaluate the people of Gaza and what they're going through, and how their psyche has been impacted by this sort of grinding pain that they're inflicted with?
Yeah, so it is correct that what we're seeing is like great signs of faith, but we shouldn't deny at the same time that Palestinians are indeed suffering and the extent to which they are. I'm currently for a different project working through surveys of mental health done to Palestinians last year. It's about 1,000 questionnaires, and it's heartbreaking to read them. There's as much suffering as you can possibly imagine. And some of the, for example, Gaza Mental Health Awareness Network has published results, and they claim that even labels such as PTSD don't work anymore, because these are thought for the Western world where all is calm and merry, and the worst thing that one can do is go to war 6 months and come back. That is much worse. So, however, Palestinians as such do have some protective factors against the major crisis that they still experiment because of the severity of what they're going through. And that is, of course, sabr and reliance on Allah. And let's not forget community support. But at the same time, even in the famous hadith where we say that one part of the body suffers, it really does suffer. Let us not romanticize that. Let us not idealize this suffering as having some sort of a value that perhaps it does not have for us. And perhaps for us, the work is to work for their mental health and to recognize that their mental health is suffering and campaigning for it and claiming that indeed is genocide causing incredible harms also on mental health, which is a forgotten field. And let us not lose our balance for just protecting ourselves, ignoring their pain.
Dr. Francesca Bocca-Aldaqre, I mean, this has been I think a really revealing conversation for me, and it's been so very instructive. So I thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks a lot.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you. Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.